If you're a wildlife photographer that wants to upgrade your gear by buying a longer zoom lens and you can't decide between the Canon 100-500 RF or the Sony FE 200-600mm lenses, this video is for you. I'm going to be comparing these two immensely popular lenses by discussing the following things: the build quality, the weight, the zoom range, the image sharpness, the minimum f-stop, the minimum focusing distance, and the price. Now, before we delve into things, let me quickly give you a little bit of background. I'm a professional photographic safari guide, and since August 2022, I've been photographing with a Canon R6 mirrorless camera and the Canon 100-500 RF lens, which I love, by the way. But because so many of my clients ask me about the Sony FE 200-600mm lens, I decided to rent one recently from Outdoor Photo in Pretoria, and I took it to Mashatu Game Reserve where I tested it for 2 weeks. And I must admit, I was very impressed. I used it on a Sony Alpha A7R5, which I also rented from Outdoor Photo. So let's start by looking at build quality. Now, this Canon 100-500mm lens that I've been using over the past 5 years has got a decent build quality, but I must admit, it's only when I held the 200-600 in my hands for the first time, and unfortunately I've had to send it back to Outdoor Photo, that I realized this actually feels quite plasticky, especially this little lens hood that a number of times felt like it was going to break when I knock it against something, and that struggles a little bit sometimes to click onto the front. Whereas with the 200-600, it's a much hardier lens, and especially this little lens hood, you'll see it's got a massive difference. It's a lot bigger and it's a lot harder as well. Now, obviously, another big difference with the build quality is the fact that when you zoom with the 100-500, it extends like this, whereas with the 200-600, it's an internal zoom, and that means less chance of dust getting in. So even though both these lenses have got a very decent build quality, I think it's fair to say that the Sony wins this round. Now, that takes me straight to the second point, and that is weight. Now, that strong build quality that I spoke about on the Sony 200-600 also makes it quite heavy, substantially heavier actually than the 100-500. The 200-600 comes in at just over 2.1 kilograms, whereas the Canon is just over 1.3 kilograms. And that is significantly lighter. And what that means is that it's a lot harder to handhold the Sony 200-600. And I felt that at Mashatu. If I had a bird in a tree and I was waiting for it to take off, I couldn't sit like this for very long before my shoulders and my arms got very tired. Whereas with this 100-500, I carry it on foot everywhere I go, whether I'm photographing birds in a campsite or just walking on a day walk. This lens never gives me any issues because it's so light, and it's part of that versatility which makes me love this lens so much. So this round, it definitely goes to the Canon 100-500. If you're going to use that 200-600, you might have to look at getting a beanbag, a tripod, or any kind of support system to help you out on game drives. The third thing that I want to talk about is the zoom range, and this is one that I'm always quite excited about because it really does make a big difference when you look at the kind of photographs that you can take. Now, both these lenses have got a 400mm zoom range. For the Canon, it's 100-500, and on the Sony, it's 200-600. And it's this big zoom range that make these two lenses so incredibly popular, because one moment you can photograph animals in the environment, and the next moment you can take a nice close-up portrait shot. But I did find that when I tested the 200-600 alongside this 100-500, that the difference between that being able to zoom out to 100 versus 200 made a significant difference when I was trying to photograph animals in the environment. So when I zoomed out on a full frame body to 200 mils, which is the widest I can go on the Sony, I was still struggling to get a proper animals in the environment shot. It was just a little bit too tight. Whereas if I use the Canon 100-500 on my full frame R6 and I'm able to zoom out all the way to 100mm, I can definitely get a nice wide landscape type shot in, putting that animal in the environment. And for me, it's one of the reasons why I love the 100-500 so much. Obviously, the sacrifice that you make with this lens is the fact that you can only zoom into 500 millimeters instead of 600. And of course, if you love taking portrait shots or you photograph a lot of birds which are slightly further away, the 200 to 600 makes a lot of sense. One day in Mashatu, we were incredibly lucky to find two tiny leopard cubs high up on a rocky ridge, and being able to zoom in that extra 100 millimeters made a significant difference. And pairing that 200 to 600 with a full frame camera like the Sony Alpha A7R5, which has so many pixels, also then allowed me to crop in a little bit extra. I think if we were able to score these two lenses when it comes to zoom range, it would be a draw. For someone like me that loves photographing wider shots, the 100 to 500 is better, but if you photograph a lot of portraits and birds, go for the 200 to 600. The fourth thing I want to discuss is image sharpness. And unfortunately, a lot of people have unrealistic expectations when it comes to these big range zoom lenses. They want them to not only be versatile, but also pin sharp, and unfortunately, they just aren't. So in other words, if you compare the image sharpness of the Canon 100 to 500 and the Sony 200 to 600 with prime lenses, like a 400 2.8 or a 500 or 600 f4, you'll definitely be disappointed. Those prime lenses are always going to be much, much sharper. On the other hand, these two lenses are significantly sharper than the slightly cheaper alternatives that a lot of people consider buying when they want these larger range zoom lenses. And here specifically, I'm talking about the Tamron 150 to 600 G2 and the Sigma Sport, also the 150 to 600 range. I have found that the Canon 100 to 500 and on my test recently in Mashatu, the Sony 200 to 600 is definitely sharper than those other lenses. For me, they're sharp enough considering what I gain by having the versatility in the lightness, the ease of use, and the zoom range. Comparing that, of course, to the heavy prime lenses. They do prefer being used in good light. In other words, your images will be sharper when it's nice and sunny, and you start losing sharpness in both lenses when it starts getting dark, and especially when your subjects are quite far away from you. I, however, couldn't find any difference in the sharpness when I compared the 100 to 500 with the 200 to 600. So again, in this round, it's a draw. The fifth thing that I want to talk about is the minimum f-stop, and I know for a lot of people this is a big concern, especially when it comes to the Canon 100 to 500 RF that only has an f4.5 to 7.1 minimum f-stop. So that means when I zoom out all the way to 100 millimeters like this, my minimum f-stop is f4.5, and when I zoom in all the way to 500 millimeters, my minimum f-stop is f7.1. Now that f7.1 is obviously significantly smaller, or at least the aperture is smaller than, say, when you use an f4 or f2.8 lens. And not only does that let in less light, but it also means the background doesn't blur quite as much. And definitely that's one of the things that you sacrifice if you get the Canon 100 to 500. The Sony 200 to 600 has a minimum f-stop of f5.6 at 200 and 6.3 at 600. So that's quite a significant difference, because remember, the background blurs more not only when the f-stop is lower, but also when you zoom in more. So that combination of the slightly smaller minimum f value, the f6.3 versus 7.1, plus the extra 100 millimeters, the 600 maximum versus the 500 maximum, definitely makes it easier to blur the background behind your subjects when you use the Sony 200 to 600. And I must say, I absolutely loved being able to do that when I was in Mashatu. Having said that, I am still able to blur the background nicely with my 100 to 500. I just have to work a little bit harder when I'm out in the field. And what I mean by that is I have to choose subjects that are not only the right distance away from me, in other words, allowing me to zoom into the maximum, but that also is in a slightly open area with the background very far behind them. If I can create that kind of scenario, I can definitely also get great portrait shots with the 100 to 500. The sixth and second last thing that I want to talk about is minimum focusing distance. And for those that don't know what that is, it's basically how close can you be to your subject and still get focus. And here's a top tip. If you're ever struggling to get focus when you're trying to photographing something close to you and you know that you are on autofocus, you're probably a little bit too close and within that minimum focusing distance. And for these two lenses, it's actually quite a significant difference. The 100 to 500 allows you to focus on something up to 90 centimeters in front of the lens, whereas with the 200 to 600, you have to be further away than 2.4 meters from it. And I have found that that definitely does make a difference. In other words, if I find something small that I want to photograph, whether that's a chameleon, a tortoise, or a dung beetle, it's a lot easier to do that with the 100 to 500 than it is to do with the Sony 200 to 600. And all of that is because of the minimum focusing distance. This round definitely goes to the Canon. Now, for those of you that haven't been keeping score, the two lenses are tied at 2-all. So the tiebreaker is the final thing that I want to mention, and that is price. So the Canon 100 to 500 here in South Africa comes in at 54,000 Rand at the moment. That's about $2,700 I saw on Amazon. Whereas the Sony 200 to 600 is only 42,000 Rand, or about $1,900 on Amazon. So quite a lot cheaper for getting something very similar. So I have to admit, as much as I love the 100 to 500, the Sony wins this round, and that means it also wins overall 3-2. So some of you might be wondering, why am I still photographing with the Canon 100 to 500 if the Sony 200 to 600 seems to be a better option, at least if you look at the things that I just mentioned? Well, I alluded to it a little bit earlier, and that is the fact that I'm able to zoom out all the way to 100 millimeters. For me, it's a deal breaker not being able to go wider than 200 if I had to use the Sony. So for many of you, there will be a specific thing that I mentioned that might help you to make the right decision in terms of what to buy. Another thing to keep in mind is that all my other gear is Canon gear as well. So if I want to switch to the Sony 200 to 600, it means I have to change the body and all the other lenses as well. And that becomes a very expensive operation. If you guys want to test either of these lenses, go and check out Outdoor Photos rental department, to which I've linked at the top of the video description. And below that, you'll also see a link to my best-selling online course called Wildlife Photography for Beginners and Amateurs, where I discuss 6 very important aspects of wildlife photography: equipment, settings, light, composition, creativity, and animal behavior. A massive thank you to all these awesome people that support my channel by making monthly donations on Patreon. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and consider becoming a patron as well. Until next time.